Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I get to talk with Jacquelyn Benson about her Raiders of the Arcana series. Thank you so much for being here, Jacquelyn.
I'm delighted to join you.
And for folks who might not have seen already, we did talk to Alex Picard, the narrator for Raiders of the Arcana. So I would go check that out too, because it's a fun little intro about how narrators work and how specifically one works with Jacquelyn.
Yeah, there are some extra pointers that I'm sure she had to give you for my stuff. I don't make life easy on Alex. She is an incredibly good sport.
Well, your books are so wonderful because of it, though, I think. And, the struggle is just the beauty.
Yeah, I mean, this whole adventure genre and kind of the armchair traveling that it allows you to do, I really wanted to bring more authenticity to that than you usually see in these kinds of books, which means that Alex has to learn lots of different accents and how to pronounce a whole lot of different languages and pronounce different languages in different accents. I think she still hasn't forgiven me for the time I made her do ancient Greek in a Scottish accent.
That was for your other series, though, right?
Was that one was for the other series? Yeah. Yeah, this time I threw reconstructed Middle Egyptian at her, and she took it like a champ.
Before we get too far, for folks who might not have seen that one or don't know what Raiders of the Arcana is, what is your elevator pitch or your little spiel of what they are?
So Raiders of the Arcana are my Mummy and Indiana Jones inspired books, but with more kissing and a geeky degree of real history, and more authentic cultural representation in the stories.
They're such wonderful adventure stories, and maybe this is because I grew up with the Mummy and Indiana Jones, and like now I get some like a woman who's doing it.
Yeah, I guess that is, I don't really even think of that part of it all that much. To me, it feels like it's potentially the big lift is just the fact that I'm trying to make these anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist because the genre is so woven through with that. But you're going to hear a truck backing out of my driveway now. I apologize. um, very much working from home. There's no like garret in an isolated palace that I get to hide in when I do this stuff. Um, it's totally distracted me. Where was I? Anti-imperialism and the anti-colonialism. I studied anthropology in college, and in an era where there was a lot of self-awareness starting to come into the field about white privilege and the white gaze. And so recognizing that if I want to write this genre, I need to be so conscious of that and really trying to respect that perspective and do the work and make sure that I'm honoring the both the history and the contemporary cultures that we're playing around in. Um, so that to me has been a bigger deal than the fact that I'm a woman doing it. But maybe I should pay more attention to that. That I yeah.
Well, so I was getting a master's in anthropology before COVID
Oh.
hit. So like I have a lot of the same kind of background where I read a lot of Bedouin like ethnographies or
Oh,
first
fantastic.
person things. And
Yeah.
I just love that your stories really feel like these women are talking and how they talk.
Mhm.
Which is what I mean by like there's a woman there.
Yeah. Well, and again, and doing the work, but also I'm very blessed with sensitivity readers who come in and help to steer me if there are things that I start to get wrong, because I will do my damnedest to do the work ahead of time before I bring books to them. But I would, I'm very grateful for having those extra eyes that have that more intimate knowledge of the culture, all the stories before they go live.
It was interesting because in the first one, Empire of Shadows, you go to British Honduras, which
Hmm.
is you don't spend much time in the British sector. You go straight to like what feels like real Honduras to me.
So British Honduras is the historical name for Belize, the country
Yeah.
of Belize, and it was a British colony. So it doesn't feel very British, but it was one of their colonial holdings, and I am purposefully avoiding diving into an elaborate description of the impact of colonialism in Belize in the 19th century. I'm not going to do it.
I know very little about it, so it's lovely to kind of see depictions of it and also kind of horrifying.
Well, and how I end up in some of these places where I tell these stories. Sometimes it's very deliberate. I always knew that Egypt was going to be one of the places we dropped into in this series. But British Honduras, I don't even know exactly how I ended up landing there. But it worked. And then that was part of what shaped um, this whole kind of British imperial baddies vibe in the stories that we're carrying through the whole series now. It tends to be very organic. I didn't know that we were going to be going to India when I started writing these books either, and that surprised me when I got to the end of the draft of Tomb of the Sun King. I said, oh, shoot, we're going to India. I need to start reading."
There's so much about Indian culture and history that is just very little known to Western audiences. So I'm excited to
Mm-hmm.
see what you do.
I have had so much fun with the research for Arrow of Fortune. I mean, I loved digging into the Egyptian stuff. I've been an Egyptology nerd since I was a kid. But as you said, I didn't have anywhere near as much knowledge of India, and it has been an absolute delight to learn all about this stuff. So yes, I am excited for you all to see where I ended up landing and what I end up playing with in the third book.
In the first book, we meet Ellie and Adam, and Ellie is
Hmm.
one of our brave suffragettes. Um,
Hmm.
and her need to change things is so it's what kind of drives the story, really.
Hmm.
Was that always kind of in there?
Yes, yeah, that was always a fundamental part of her character to me. And doing more research, so much of this comes back to the research, but doing more research into just how feisty these ladies were. It's funny to me that I get occasionally we'll see, I try not to read my negative reviews, but every now and then one will get through the filter. And how often I get dinged for people saying that she's too feminist for the period. And I was like, oh, ladies, you have no idea what they were getting up to in this time. This is not this is not a new fight. These are not new ideas. They've been around for a long time.
Well, really, it's off of the back of suffragettes that we have this idea that maybe it wasn't like that then. Like they've made it
Hmm.
to the point where we are comfortable enough that, you know,
Right. Yeah, or we don't recognize just how hard they actually had to fight
yeah.
to create such massive social change. And it took the First World War
Mhm.
and the increased economic activity that women were engaged in, and how many men in Europe were dead as a result of that. And all these other socioeconomic dynamics for them to finally win the battle. But they were putting their bodies on the line in this. And so that's always been a part of history that I'm very interested in. Um, and so having a character who has that as part of her background, yeah, it was definitely key for me in all of this.
Connie is a little spitfire. You call her what? Neil calls her a danger gnome. Is that what
She's
it is?
the danger gnome, yes. Hmm.
And she is even more brazen in what she does because I feel like her background is a little bit stricter than Ellie's would have even been. Um,
It's interesting. I think her personality almost comes from the fact that she has this very, very strong family, which you will be learning more about in the third book, because that's part of what we're doing is going to visit Connie's other half of her family that we haven't met yet. Um, and I feel like there are people who become bold in spite of their upbringing, and there are people who become bold because their upbringing gives them this foundation of security that allows them to take chances. And I think that's Connie. Like, she knows that no matter pretty much no matter what she does, she's got, her mom, her dad, her grandma, they all have her back. Um, yeah, it doesn't always have to come from somebody being orphaned in a horribly tragic carriage accident, you know. I was deliberately have been setting myself the challenge to create characters who have living, healthy, emotionally stable parents. Because we don't see that so much in the fantasy genre.
Were there any scenes that were cut or anything that had Ellie or Connie's parents in them? Because we get a little bit of Connie's parents, but not so much of Ellie's.
No, Ellie's parents, we have not really dug too much into. We had a little taste of her stepmother, Florence, who is Neil, her brother's mom, her stepbrother's mom. Um, I I'm hesitating to promise anything because as I'm going through these books, the plans for what comes next always end up changing. But if all goes according to my current plan, then we would end up returning to England at some point in this series, and we'll likely be encountering Ellie's parents a little more in depth there. We definitely are going to be spending a lot more time with Constance's grandmother in book 3. So, yeah, we can all look forward to that.
I'm just waiting for the day that you do a little prequel novella about her grandma.
That's a great idea. I might hold on to that one.
Because you do a lot of extra content on your Patreon, right?
I do, yeah. The Patreon, there are bonus scenes, bonus stories, and some spicy bonus material. The books have very strong romantic character arcs. I hesitate to call them romances because the romance isn't necessarily central to the story, and because we're following the same couple in some cases over multiple books, it doesn't always follow the same genre structure that people are looking for in a straight up romance novel. But it's definitely there, and the physical nature of those relationships is also part of the story. But I did not end up putting the spice in the books because it didn't feel quite right for the genre that we were playing with. And so Patreon felt like a fun place to go ahead and provide that if there are people that felt like they were missing that from the stories. Um, and yeah, and they've been very happy over there. So I guess it works.
I absolutely went over and downloaded like I made little PDFs and shoved them in the books where they would go in chapters. So
Oh,
now
that's
the
fun.
story's complete. So like I have like the beginning story before um Empire Shadows. There's like a little
Prequel novella.
yeah.
Yep. Stolen apocalypse. Yes. Yep.
So my books are kind of warped at the moment.
That's fun though. That's a fun idea. And I mean, people can read just the books and they're not missing anything deeply fundamental in that. But I do the having those little extras, it's fun. And since I tend to conceptualize stories in 150,000 words of content, the challenge of trying to write some small things every now and then, I think is just healthy for me.
The small things are it's funny because a lot of the novellas are they're longer novellas, it feels like, but maybe that's just my perception.
They could be. In my other series, London Charismatics, that was originally meant to be a trilogy, and there was going to be a short novella in between the second and third book. And I had this panicked conversation with a lovely writer friend of mine, Nicholas Atwater, where I was like, I don't know how to do this. Here's all the stuff that I feel like we have to do, and I'm listing it all off. And he was like, "Sweetie, you have another book and a novella." So that's been known to happen.
Oh goodness. Well, at least you have someone there that's like encouraging this bad behavior.
Yeah, oh no, he is shameless about it. Yeah, it's he's not apologizing for any of it. I'm almost afraid to send him manuscripts he does some beta reading for me, and I'm afraid to send him the manuscript because I'm afraid he's going to turn around and be like, oh, look, you have an extra book right here. Did you see that? And I'll go, oh, no.
Now I have to divert. No diverting.
Yep. Yep.
You seem to be able to write pretty quickly, though, because it feels like, or maybe it's just my perception of time.
Well, these things are so relative, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I have writer friends who write like a book every 3 months.
that's too
And I'm
much.
like, how do you do this? I've been putting out probably about one a year. Sometimes they come a little sooner than that. Um, but the amount of homework that I have to do before I can sit down to write, because if it's not a different place and a different culture and a different piece of history, like in the Raiders books, it was just the European history side of things with charismatics. I had to teach myself. I knew almost nothing about World War One. I set out to write that series, and then I had to put us in the middle of, the Western Front in 1918. Um, and so there's a good solid couple of months where it's just research and starting to noodle around with what the story looks like. And then all of that I keep filling in holes in what I need to know as I'm going along through the writing process, because you keep stumbling across different things. And then there are all these wonderful little bits of it that you find that you don't get to put in the story. And I'm just saving them, holding on to them. I've given them away to some other authors.
Ooh.
Um, yes, I once tried to figure out how you could break into the British Museum through the London sewer system. And in doing so, found that the basement of the British Museum has a room in the late 19th century, had a room marked the skeleton room. And
Oh,
I was like, this is the best. And I didn't end up any of that. It didn't fit in my books. So I gave it to my friend Susanna Rowntree, and she put it in her book. And it is a really fun scene that she
oh,
wrote with it. So
now I have to go find her book.
oh, you need to find her books. They're so much fun. Yeah. Yeah. She's got a great series too. There are two related series that she does um that are these very kind of rompy gas lamp heists set in an alternative late 19th century England and Europe. And if you like the whole kind of witty banter, slow burn romance thing that I have, you should absolutely go check out her stuff. I'm shamelessly plugging her because I love it. It's so fun. Yeah.
But you're also not afraid to go back and change stories that you've written, because with Raiders, Empire of Shadows
Mm-hmm.
was a different book.
It was. So I wrote that book. That was actually the first book that I wrote was called The Smoke Hunter, and it was published traditionally. All my other books since then I've done independently, but this first one was a traditionally published book. And it came out and just nobody heard of it. Nobody saw it. But I'd always wanted that story to be a series. I always knew there was more I wanted to do. And I would still have people who would find the book who would be like, when are we getting more? So after I finished the charismatics, I pulled it back out, and I was just going to jump in and write the sequel. But I sat down to read through the manuscript, and I said, I'm 10 years on from when I wrote this book. If I write a sequel to this as it is not going to seem like this was written by the same person. Like you grow in this job, you learn the craft, and you get better at what you're doing. And Nicholas Atwater, again, the little gnome on my shoulder who's causing me all these problems, was the one who finally said to me, why don't you just, instead of trying to revise this manuscript or tweak this or tweak that about it, why don't you sit down and write this story the way you would if you had thought of it just now? Give yourself freedom to completely take it down to nuts and bolts and rebuild it the way you would want it to be. And that was the light bulb moment of I can take everything I learned over 10 years and another four and a half books and put that to play with crafting the story. And I'm so glad that I did, because I know a lot of people love the Smoke Hunter, the six of them that found it and read it. Um, and I have there's nothing I'm ashamed of in that manuscript, but I it was so much I was so much more capable of bringing these characters and this adventure to life now than I was then. I really got to make the story what I wanted it to be. And I'm really glad that I had that opportunity. And that's the whole indie publishing thing. That's where that kind of comes in handy because traditional publishing won't let you do that. But once I got the rights back for the book, I could do whatever I wanted with it, and nobody could tell me no.
How long did it take you to get the rights back, or did you petition to get them back or something?
It was actually not very hard. The book wasn't selling because it was just hiding in the backlist for the publisher. So my contract had a clause in there for rights reversion, and I utilized that, and they didn't fight me on it. They were fine. They were very graceful. Um, I know other authors who've had more challenges getting rights back to books, but that was thankfully not my experience. So way less complicated than you would think it would be.
Do you find it much more freeing to be able to just self-publish now since you've been through
Absolutely.
that traditional publishing?
Yes. My background, I mean, now I write. That's my job. I'm doing this full time. But before I did this full time, for years, I did marketing. I was a marketing consultant. And so knowing what could be done for the book, but not being able to do it in a way where I knew I could get a return on investment or see immediate data for feedback on what was working and what wasn't was very crippling. And so for me, that made indie publishing such a logical step because I already knew how to do a lot of this stuff. And now I had ownership over the books. And I could all the things that I knew were potentially good marketing strategies, I could just do them. I can just do them. And I can take the material and play with it in whatever way I want. So I love it. I I'd be hard pressed to go back to trad. I know a lot of authors who do both or who just do trad and they love it and they're having a great time, but I love all this control. And these are my babies. So the idea that I could hand over these rights to somebody who wouldn't do them justice would be the worst thing. So yeah, this is probably going to be my jam going forward.
I couldn't imagine if somebody tried to purchase them and then redo the audio either, like, because Alex just
No.
is these people for me.
Yes, that would I don't know that I would let them. I'm not sure I would sell those rights because no, she's a master. And I feel so grateful to have found her. And I found her, I knew her as like a friend before she started even doing audiobooks. And then when I was listening to her samples, when I was looking for a narrator, just because she had reached out and said, I love your stuff. Would you even look at me if you're thinking of doing audio? And I was like, oh, I'm cautious about working with friends because it can be, um, there can be complications to the experience. Or if something doesn't work out, are you risking a friendship? Um, but she had the perfect depth, and I knew she could carry emotional tone in a way that I feel like I don't hear necessarily all that often in audiobooks. Like I know there are wonderful narrators out there, but there's also like she was a performer, a stage performer before she was an audiobook narrator. And I think you can really hear that in what she does with the characters and with even just the narrative voice as she's going through the story.
Yeah, and she does such a good job of narrating both men and women that
Mm-hmm.
I really would have despised, or not despised, but greatly less appreciated a dual POV, like dual narrators, I suppose.
Even
Uh,
though we did talk about it, she and we floated the idea. But the problem with it was that going into book four, now we have four point of view
oh,
characters.
that's too many.
And now we would be looking at four to stick with sort of the structure of how this is usually done. That now you're looking at four narrators that you've got to try to coordinate. And the thing is, Alex can do it.
Yeah.
Like her dude voices, Adam is so whew. It's so good. He sounds just like he should in my head. Her Strangford in the other series is like, And I love how she does Sam. Like her, yeah, gender is not confining her. Um, and I haven't had, I think I've seen once or twice, I've had somebody say they wished that there was a male, that it was dual narration, that there was a male narrator, but it is like 0.2% of the people who are listening to the books.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is very preferential. So like don't
Yeah.
like I'm not
Yeah.
hating on it. I just
No, people have their flavor and it can depend on the project,
Oh
you
yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, one of the other things that I noticed right out the bat of Empire of Shadows is you do a lot of language switching. Do you have to study these languages first?
I do a little. Yeah. So some of the stuff I will pick out and research myself. So the Middle Egyptian, for example, I had to find sources that had transcribed reconstructed Middle Egyptian, and I just stole from them. I said, okay. And some of it was like the curse that's in Tomb of the Sun King is a combination of two different curses that were in a doctoral thesis that someone did on um, cursing in Egyptian tombs. And I had to, but I had to learn enough Egyptian, Middle Egyptian grammar to be able to know like which of these words meant which, so that when I swapped them out and put them back together again, I was hopefully doing it the right way. I also, for other languages, like when I use Mandarin in the charismatics books, the Arabic phrases from Tomb of the Sun King, those I hire translators to do that
Okay.
for me. You know, the even the Spanish from Tomb of the Sun King, I wanted someone who spoke Mexican Spanish so that
Mhm.
it, you know, the vocabulary and phraseology would be accurate to someone who would come from the Yucatan. Um, Other languages, it's harder to find. Like I couldn't find anyone who could translate Yucatec Mayan for me. I'm sure they're out there, but they
Yeah.
weren't on Fiverr. So that was I find phrase books and I'll take stuff out of phrase books or things like that and use it. So it's a mixed bag. I try not to have to teach myself all the languages, but sometimes I have to. Um, Sometimes it's unavoidable.
Well, there are just so many different groups of people in here that it seemed unavoidable to have this many languages.
Hmm. Yeah, and in book three, we've got some Odia, which is one of the languages of India. India has so many of them, but we're in the region of Odisha and Chhattisgarh, so we have some Odia phrases that are in there. It every book is a little exciting journey. Um, and then I end up with things like, wow, I'm going to reference Akkadian in this one. And now I need to go find an Akkadian dictionary. Another one in Arrow of Fortune was I have a group of people who are based on the Khand in India, and they have their own language. And that one I couldn't find a translator for. So I'm pulling things from phrase books and utilizing stuff where, and sometimes it limits what I can say, you know. Um, but I feel like it adds a level of kind of like detail to the manuscript to hear those words, you know? And a lot of these characters do code switch and they do
Mhm.
use different languages depending on who they're interacting with. And I want to represent that accurately too. So I have to fudge things a little bit here and there. There are people I have speaking English sometimes where I'm like, let's figure out how you would have known English because we can't use a language that you know most of the readers are not familiar with for like pages of the book. But as long as y'all forgive me for the occasional leap, we can keep rolling.
I don't think many people notice it if it's not a language that's widely spoken in the US.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I also don't mind not knowing what some of these words are or some of these
Yeah.
phrases
Yeah.
because I get it from the tone or like,
Well,
yeah.
that's the goal, right? So I don't want anyone to ever be confused about what's happening. There was a scene that I wrote in What the Ravens Sing, which is the last book of the Charismatics, where there are two characters who are, my point of view character is an English woman, and she is accidentally eavesdropping on a conversation between two characters who are speaking Mandarin. And the conversation is in Mandarin, but I wrote it in such a way that, like, you're hearing how she's interpreting the tone of
Mm-hmm.
everything that's being said. And so that you understand this conversation, even if you don't know the language of the words in which it's being spoken. And I've never had anybody come back to me about that scene and be like, I was confused, you know? Um, and it doesn't always have to be, this is what this means, or here's this direct translation. You can, direct translations are one tool that you can use, but a lot of this is about its context and its emotion and its how these words impact another character. Um, and it takes a little trial and error, and that's where your beta readers can come in really handy, to point out if you've not explained something enough or contextualized something enough, they can point it out to you. Um, but it's doable, and I don't think people should avoid playing with non-English terms and words and phrases in their manuscripts, because sometimes it's appropriate, it fits.
And then you have characters like Neil who will always say it's slightly incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, that was a fun rabbit hole to go down into, like, Arabic phonemes and Middle Egyptian phonemes. And I would sit at my desk trying to make the ka sound. I'm still not that good at it. I'm more like Neil. Alex nailed it. Of course she did, you know,
Well, she said she found someone. Uh,
who could teach her how.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes, she's had to call in a lot of favors for my books.
I do love though in Tomb of the Sun King, there is that conversation about language and trying to communicate because the subtext is Neil does not understand the societal context of what's happening.
Right. He has to wake up to it. A lot of the theme for his character in that book was about someone who is a nice guy, but who has not yet opened up his eyes to his own privilege. And it was very important to me that that was a theme of the story that we worked through, both in his relationship with his sister and in his relationship with Saeed. Um, I mean, I hadn't thought about that, how the language is kind of a parallel metaphor for that. So sometimes these things just pop out of your head and you don't even know that you're doing it.
Well, I think it fits just because this is how it would have happened, right? Like there would have been an
Mhm.
Englishman who probably didn't know the correct pronunciation for everything and didn't really
Right.
understand the context of, well, this person cannot ever have their own dig site.
Yeah, well, I think in particularly in that time period, you did have people in that time period who were aware of ethnic and race-based social disparity and were campaigning against it. It wasn't that these ideas didn't exist, but they certainly weren't mainstream.
Mhm.
And I think it's very plausible. I'm sure, I mean, we know that a lot of the archaeologists who were operating in Egypt during that time period um, undervalued their Egyptian workers, and that the structure of the whole system for how archaeology was conducted during that period was all about foreigners. There was no conception that Egyptians could be anything but labor, basically, for this effort. Um, and there were brilliant Egyptologists from that time period, but their opportunities were so much narrower. Um, I based Saeed's father on an actual late 19th, early 20th century Egyptologist whose story thankfully had a much happier ending. But a lot of his background, like the school that he went to, I took all of that from this actual character, and I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but I think I mentioned it in the afterword of the book. If anybody wants to go dig down that rabbit hole after me.
It's wonderful that fiction allows you to use real stories to kind of get points across or get emotional like themes
Yeah.
across.
Yeah, I have an agenda. I'm not even going to pretend. I am here to wokeify adventure fiction.
Well, Well, so one of the first times I saw Empire of Shadows, either you had written a blurb or someone had written a blurb that it was like Jewel of the Nile or like Romancing the Stone.
Romancing the Stone. Yeah.
And while that's a silly movie, I don't feel like it fits quite as well because they are quite oblivious to what's going on around them in
Yes.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Indiana Jones is oblivious to
Oh
what's
my
going
gosh,
on
yes.
around him too. And I love those movies. I still love those movies. Some of them I can love a little more than others. There's some that I have a hard time watching now. Um, yeah, and so that was the project here. I love this stuff. I grew up with it. I've read everything H.R. Haggard ever wrote, you know. The whole Amelia Peabody series was just delighted. And that one is a little bit more culturally sensitive, I think, than some of them. But to make it where you could read, again, having that background in an academic world where these questions are very, very strongly being asked, and there's a lot of self-reflection that's going on, it would have felt irresponsible to take any other approach to this. So
I love your use of the folklore of the area as well to kind of tell you where to find these things and how to like navigate
mhm.
the area. Because I feel like people undervalue folklore and its reliability.
Well, there's folklore and then there's history, and the
Yeah.
line between those can be very blurred, you know. I mean, if you're referring to Empire of Shadows, um, yeah, you could call that folklore, but these were, the documents that I'm referencing they're historical documents. They're
Mm.
historical transcriptions of the stories that people were telling about the origin of their society. The Egypt stuff that's all history. That's all. I wouldn't call that one folklore at all, you know. But then now in book three, we're playing with the Ramayana, which some folks would call that folklore. Some folks would call that a religious document, you know.
Mhm.
And other folks would call it history. Some of these things exist, and they're viewed through different lenses depending on your own cultural background. Um, and again, just trying to make sure that in referencing them myself, I'm not excluding any of those views,
Mhm.
and that I'm particularly trying to be respectful of the culture that claims this the most as their own.
Okay. One of the things that is a major contentious point between Adam and Ellie is the topic of marriage. And you hinted on your Patreon that they might kind of work something out. Is that the case?
I'm telling you nothing.
Ah, damn it.
Nope, mouth is shut. You got to read the books and find out where I'm going with that.
Because it's
But
an interesting discussion, though.
yeah, and again, that's another one that was accurate to the time period. There were women who refused to get married.
Mhm.
There weren't a lot of them, but they were there. Um, and I think it adds an interesting dynamic to their relationship for the two of them to work it through. But of course, it's important to me in writing, these are witty banter romance dynamics, right? But I always want, I don't like miscommunication tropes, and I don't like people who just kind of get stuck in their own ways and they're not hearing each other, and that's used to develop conflict. I would rather have like two people who are being decent humans,
Mhm.
and maybe sometimes they have to work to figure out where each other are coming from, or even to understand in themselves why they're having the reaction that they are to something, because that's very real. That happens. And plus, we want these dudes to be just adorable studly cupcakes that we want to take home, and it wouldn't be like that if they were stubbornly refusing to acknowledge your point of view.
I feel like there's been a lot of books written from that point of view, though.
No, there sure are. There are a lot of them out there. Yeah, that's one of, that drives me a little bit bananas.
Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the reasons I latched on to Raiders of the Arcana so quickly and easily is
Mhm.
because these feel like real people. Yeah.
Well, they're real in my head. I work from home, obviously. I have an office in my house, and I like to talk about how I'm alone all day except for the people that live in my brain that I made up. But, they're great company. So there's that.
Well, I imagine most of them are. Um,
Even the baddies are fun.
well, you hinted at, oh God, now I don't remember his name, the main bad guy, the British guy.
Jacobs.
Yeah, you hinted
Hmm.
at him having a background,
Oh
like
yeah.
a
Hmm.
tumultuous background, and now I just can't keep speculating. I keep speculating what it might be, and I'm like, I don't know where you're gonna go.
I will tell you that you will learn significantly more about Jacob's motivations and where he came from in book 3.
Is he still a baddie though, or is he?
Yep, he's still a baddie.
Yeah. Because I feel like there are people who have terrible backgrounds, but are still just genuinely not good people.
We kind of dig into that question
Okay.
a little bit in the book, so I'm not
Okay,
gonna
fair.
give too much more away. But there, yeah, I mean, these were all things that I wanted to explore with his character. I am not a big fan of the cackling, stereotypical, I'm bad for the sake of it villain. Um, I try to make my bad guys feel like the people you actually see in the world doing things that are awful, because there are plenty of them around, you know. We don't have to look too far to find them, and they fall into a handful of categories. But very few of those are, you know, tying people to the tracks and twirling their mustaches. So
I do think that there is an overcorrection sometimes where there'll be like a character that's evil or bad, and
mhm.
then their decisions or their motivations will have been excused away because they've had traumatic lives or something.
Yeah, you run into that too, especially if we're going to turn them into love interests.
Oh God, yeah.
um, there are villain redemption stories
Yeah.
that can be so well done. I'm not saying that I would never do that, but it's not what I'm drawn to.
I think maybe the internet is frozen. Mm.
People to be potentially a little more dodgy, and then there's kind of an ethical question that comes into play there of how much of this is choice and how much of this is, I don't know. Anyway, it's all fun stuff to play with.
That is very fair. I'm super excited for book 3 now, though, and it doesn't come out till December.
November 18th. It comes out on November 18th. I mean, the book's written, but I
Oh,
have edits that I need to do. It'll need to go through a proofreader, and then Alex is going to be recording it before it comes out so that we can finally release the audio at the same time. All my other books, the audio has followed, months or even a year or so after the book was released. But I'm finally getting my act together enough to get it put out at the same time as the rest of the formats.
are you going to do another Kickstarter too for was it in
The
1888?
1898 edition. So yes, I will be doing an 1898 edition. Looking at like maybe late January or early February of next year, because I don't want to have to juggle a Kickstarter and a book release at the same time. It's just purely for my mental health. uh,
Understandable.
but yeah, definitely. And we're already working on cover art for that. And we're working on like picking out the cloth binding and things like that. So, the project is already rolling along. Um, I'm excited to pick out what scenes we'll do illustrations of, because that's been one of my favorite parts of this whole Kickstarter process, is getting artwork for some of these moments from the books. And the artist that I've been working with, Adeline Art. I know how to read it, but not how to say it.
Fair.
Uh, she's got such a great sense of the characters and the stories. So it's just been a joy to see how she depicts this stuff.
And if folks haven't picked up the first two, can they get them in that Kickstarter then as
Yeah.
add-ons?
Yep. We'll have extra copies. We're ordering extras. So yeah, they'll still be able to get the first 2 books. if they want to jump in on it. But if they don't want to have to buy them all at once because they're fancy and so they can be a little pricey, they still can currently get the first two books through the late backer store for the
Okay.
Tomb of the Sun King campaign. And there's a link to that in my Instagram bio if people are trying to hunt for it, or you just if you go to Tomb of the Sun King on Kickstarter, they'll see a button there. But yeah, we haven't closed that off yet, so that's another option for folks.
Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
This was delightful. Thank you for having me. And as you can tell, I am more than happy to geek out about this stuff.
Um, Again, for everybody out there who hasn't yet read Raiders of the Arcana, book 1 and 2 are out. Book 3 is out November 18th. And look out for the Kickstarter. Thanks and have a great day.